Hello everyone, this Dr. Alex, and I'm glad to have you here. Today, we're diving into a fascinating area of linguistics, how the words we use every day aren't just labels, but actually build the world around us. In this first module, Putting Gender and Language on the Map, we are going to explore how language reflects, and more importantly, shapes our understanding of gender. We'll start by looking back at early approaches, both feminist and non-feminist, to see how researchers first tried to figure out why men and women seem to speak differently. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of sexist language. We aren't just talking about obvious insults. We're looking at subtle patterns like lexical gaps, asymmetries, and those generic expressions that might not be so generic after all. Finally, we'll talk about how we can actually intervene, how changing our vocabulary can drive social change. By the end of this session, you'll be able to summarize these early studies and understand exactly how feminist linguistics became the influential field it is today. Before we talk about gender, we have to talk about how we view language itself. Historically, people thought language was just a mirror. It simply reflected who we are. But in this course, we're embracing a fundamental shift. Language doesn't just reflect social reality, it constructs it. Think about it this way. The words we choose have the power to establish and maintain social relations and values. For example, why is one person's terrorist another's freedom fighter? Or consider how dehumanizing language, like calling people specimens or cockroaches, has been used historically to enable violence and wars. In terms of gender, when we say male nurse or lady doctor, we are signaling that gender matters in those roles, which reveals our underlying assumptions about what is normal. To truly understand gender relations, we have to look beyond the words themselves and see the broader social processes they are tucked into. Language is a dynamic resource, and every time we speak, we are making meaningful selections that shape our reality. Now, let's clear up a common point of confusion: sex versus gender. While we often use them as synonyms, in linguistics they are very different. Sex is biological. It's about the physiological and anatomical differences that distinguish men and women. Gender, however, is a social construct. It refers to the traits, roles, and expectations that different cultures assign to a sex. Why does this matter? Because biological differences alone can't explain the vast variety of life experiences people have. Gender traits are learned and socially determined, which means they are alterable. We aren't just born a gender, we actually do gender through our actions and language. This distinction is political because historically, natural biological explanations have been used to justify imbalances, like saying women are naturally only suited for nurturing roles. Modern research even shows that both sex and gender are more complex than a simple binary choice. Think of cases involving intersexed individuals where gender identity follows the assigned sex rather than just biology. How did we get here? Let's look at the timeline of how we've studied this. In the early days, the 1920s, we had people like Otto Jesperson. His work relied on what we call folk linguistics, basically stereotypes disguised as research. He claimed women used empty adverbs like awfully pretty and couldn't finish sentences because they hadn't thought them through. Obviously, we've moved past that. In the 1970s and 80s, there was an explosion of research. We started looking at sex preferential usage, real data on how men and women used phonology or conversational styles. But even then, researchers often ignored social roles. Today, from the 1990s onward, we've shifted from investigating men versus women to looking at language as a social practice. We now focus on discourse, context, and how gender identity is performed in specific communities. We've moved from seeing gender as a biological category of the speaker to seeing it as something produced within the interaction itself. Now let's talk about a heavy word: sexism. The term was coined in the 60s, modeled after racism, to describe discrimination based on sex. It operates in a system where one sex is treated as the norm, and the other as other or inferior. One of the biggest issues we study is the generic he, using he, him, or man to refer to everyone. We call these false generics. If I say man is a mammal that breastfeeds his young, it sounds ridiculous, right? That proves man isn't truly neutral. It promotes male imagery and makes women invisible. We also look at things like semantic derogation, where words for women, like mistress or madam, start neutral but become negative or sexualized over time, while male equivalents like master stay prestigious. From lexical gaps, having no female equivalent for virility, to gratuitous modifiers, like lady doctor. These linguistic choices reinforce a patriarchal order. Our goal isn't just to list words, but to demystify how they sustain inequality. So, how do we fix it? Language change happens naturally, but we can also use linguistic intervention to speed it up. This means using gender-neutral terms like firefighter or flight attendant, and opting for Ms. to avoid defining women by their marital status. But it's not always easy. Intervention often faces ridicule, like people mocking the term herstory, or denial that there's even a problem. Even neutral words can be used in sexist ways. For example, if I say people took picnics with their girls, I'm using the neutral word people, but still excluding women from that category. This is why context and intentionality matter more than just individual words. Effective change must happen at both personal and institutional levels. Feminist linguistics today isn't just about women's talk. It's a political movement that links language to power and diversity. We're looking forward to a world where language allows for new, evolving identities. Now, you might ask, why do we make such a big deal about the difference between sex and gender? It's because this distinction is deeply political. Historically, biological explanations for socially constructed behaviors have been used to justify male privilege, or to trap people in traditional roles, like the idea that women are naturally only suited for nurturing. Feminists argue that these biological myths create harmful stereotypes for everyone. Recent studies even show that both sex and gender are more complex than a simple either-or binary. For example, intersexed infants often develop a gender identity based on the sex they were assigned at birth, not just their biology. This proves that our social labels have massive power over our lived reality. By challenging these dichotomies, we open up space for people to define themselves outside of rigid, outdated boxes. To appreciate where we are, we have to see where we started. Early pre-feminist linguistics often relied on folk linguistics, basically widely held beliefs that weren't actually tested. A classic example is Otto Jesperson's work from 1922. He made claims that women use more empty adverbs like awfully pretty, don't finish their sentences, and have smaller vocabularies than men. He even suggested men were the true linguistic innovators. While these claims feel very dated and sexist now, they were the standard because there wasn't much rigorous research at the time. It's a reminder that without systematic study, our common sense about how people talk is often just a reflection of our own biases and stereotypes. Look at how much has changed in a century. From the 1920s to the 60s, research was very limited and relied heavily on those biological stereotypes we just discussed. Then came the explosion of the 70s and 80s. This era focused on sex preferential usage, looking at actual data on how men and women use different sounds or conversational styles. Think of scholars like Labov and Trudgill. However, even then, they often viewed sex as a fixed biological category. Since the 90s, we've seen a massive shift toward viewing language as a social practice. We no longer just ask, how do women talk? We ask, how is gender performed in this specific context? We've moved from biological certainties to understanding gender as a dynamic, ongoing process. Let's define our terms. The word sexism was actually coined in the 1960s, modeled after the word racism. It describes discrimination within a social system where one sex is treated as the norm and the other is marked as different or inferior. Because language is such a powerful tool for building our world, we have to examine it critically. Our focus has evolved. We don't just look at bias in abstract dictionaries anymore. We look at how bias shows up in everyday use and sexist discourses that might be subtle or even hidden. We're moving from identifying bad words to understanding the whole system of meaning that keeps inequality alive. A classic example of linguistic bias is the generic use of he, him, and his to refer to everyone. Grammatically, we're told this is neutral, but research shows it's not. It reinforces a world where the male is the default and the female is deviant or invisible. Look at these examples. Man is the only primate that commits rape sounds normal to us, but man is a mammal that breastfeeds his young, or man has difficulty in childbirth sounds absurd. This proves that man isn't actually a true generic. It forces a male image into our minds, effectively erasing women from the conversation. Bias in English shows up in several specific ways. We have sex specification, like calling a boat she, or using outdated terms like authoress. Then there are lexical gaps. We have tons of words for promiscuous women, but almost none for men. We use gratuitous modifiers like lady doctor or male nurse, which draws unnecessary attention to gender, as if it's a surprise in that profession. There's also semantic derogation, where neutral words for women, like mistress, become negative slurs over time. Finally, we see asymmetric terms. Think Mrs. versus Mr. Mrs. tells the world a woman's marital status, while Mr. keeps it private, reinforcing a patriarchal order. Newspapers give us a perfect window into how these biases play out. Consider sports journalism. Male athletes are usually described using words like Wonder Boy, phenomenon, or amazing athlete, focusing entirely on their performance and prowess. But look at how female athletes are treated. They are cute, fetching in powder blue, or the little blonde from Moscow. The focus shifts from their skill to their appearance, which is often completely irrelevant to the sport. This trivializes their achievements and signals to the reader that for women, looks matter more than talent. Sexism isn't always a blatant insult. Sometimes it's subtle. Take this interview with Dr. Heather Clark, a helicopter emergency doctor. The journalist used terms like trauma queen, China doll, and child dressed up as a doctor. You'd never hear a male doctor described that way, right? The article obsessed over her small size and big blue eyes, and even questioned if she could be a proper mother while working such hours. Meanwhile, the male doctors in the same unit, who also have kids, weren't scrutinized at all. This shows that sexist meaning isn't just in single words, it's in the entire way we frame a person's life and choices. So how do we push back? Language change often happens naturally as society evolves, but we can also use linguistic intervention. This involves setting guidelines to promote inclusion, like using flight attendant instead of air hostess, or chair instead of chairman. We can increase visibility by using he or she, or even they, them. We can also reclaim meaning. Think of how the word queer has been transformed from a slur into a positive identity within the community. This kind of intervention shows up in workplace policies, awareness training, and gender-neutral job ads. It's about being intentional with our linguistic resources. Of course, trying to change language faces resistance. People often use ridicule, mocking terms like herstory, marginalization, saying it's a trivial issue, or denial. Look at the Ms. example. It was meant to be a neutral alternative to Miss or Mrs., but for some, it became a stereotype for divorcees or strident feminists. The fundamental problem is that there is no neutral language. We are always making choices between different value systems. Context and interpretation matter more than just the word itself, and these negative reactions often stem from a broader resistance to feminist progress. We have to remember that a sexist word can be used in non-sexist ways, and vice versa. It all depends on the context and the inferential work we do. For instance, words like queer or dyke have been reclaimed as symbols of pride within gay communities. On the flip side, even a neutral word like people can be used to exclude women, like in the phrase, "people took picnics with their girls," implying people only means men. Or think of family sections in some restaurants that specifically define women only through their relationships. Meaning isn't a static thing in a dictionary. It's something we build together in every conversation. Here is a vital truth. Changing sexist language alone won't kill sexism. We have to address it as part of a much larger fight against gender inequality. We need to challenge discursive practices, the underlying assumptions baked into our linguistic choices. But we also need institutional change, legal, social, and organizational reforms. For example, changing how we talk about rape in reports only works if we also fix the legal system to increase conviction rates and support victims better. Language reflects our progress, but it also helps consolidate the real-world changes we make in our laws and institutions. Because of past feminist successes, blatant sexism is less common, but we now face more insidious forms. Today, sexist language is often used ironically. People assume that because everyone knows it's sexist, they can say it as a joke and not mean it. We see this in men's magazines, advertising, and even workplace banter. If a woman speaks up against it, she's often dismissed as being too serious or politically correct. But don't confuse political correctness, which is often just media-made rules, with anti-sexism, which is about real, localized campaigns for dignity and equality. So, where does that leave us? Feminist linguistics is our path forward. It explicitly aligns with feminism as a political movement to resist gender inequality. It goes beyond just men versus women to theorize the deep relationships between femininity and masculinity. We focus on the diversity and co-construction of identities, how we create who we are in every interaction. We examine power and the ways we can enact new, temporary, and historical identities. As we find new social resources, we can assign new meanings to gender. It's an ongoing journey, and your voice is a key part of that map.